thank you so much for finding time to stay with me. And it's the world is crazy in a sense that there's so much happening, and people who are interested in certain fields, they know of the experts, of the masters of the realm, but then the world is so saturated that nobody knows everyone and everything. So I always want to make sure that people know a little bit about the exciting people that I meet. So could you say a few words about your background?
Yeah, sure. So this is 2019, although it'll be under the bottom of the video, I assume. So this is my 55th year in martial arts. So I started when I was 15, 1964, in a karate club. Very typical, traditional Wado-ryu karate club in Manchester. I started at 15, I was teaching at 16. So I was teaching beginners at 16. And in those days, there were no children. It was all adults. And I had to fight. My hardest fight was to get them to let me join in the first place. After that, everything was downhill. And I had two instructors, one called Martin Stott, who was really one of the earliest karate people in the UK, and somebody who became a sort of martial arts brother of mine, Danny Connor, who's no longer with us now, died over 10 years ago. And that was fairly typical. So a typical traditional karate club, competitions, training each week. But the turning point for me was in about 1969, when the northern clubs of the group I was in were looking for a home and a change. We'd left the Japanese Wado guys behind, and we actually came across the Shukakai, which I'd been mentioning to you before. And Shukakai was developed by a very open-minded Japanese instructor, one of Mabune's students, a guy called Tani, Sensei Tani. His principal instructor was Shigeru Kimura, who became, in the UK, our chief instructor, domiciled in the UK. And that was the introduction of a whole new karate world for me. It was dynamics, it was dealing with a totally different Japanese mentality. Very open, very anglicised, very accommodating, could ask questions, and it was dynamic. And the principal thing that came out of that, apart from some other dynamic issues, was the double hip, which I've kept going and put into everything, whether it was Wing Chun, kickboxing, karate, self-defense, door work. That double hip has run through everything because it's all about impact development. From about 67, 8 onwards, I was a fairly consistent member of the Great Britain and England karate teams. That took me up. The last international I fought in was on the England team in 1974, the Europeans in London at Crystal Palace. After that, I fought full contact for a short while. At the same time, 71, I started working on the doors. Had 8 years, one door in Manchester, and then in the 80s had a small chain of clubs and pubs. So I was running the doors for those. They were in Manchester again, Salford and Manchester. Wing Chun, as you know, I have always had an interest in Wing Chun, interest in boxing, kickboxing, and over the years, taken all those elements, linked with a unique dynamic oil, if you like, that puts them all together, and made that sort of quite special, I think, system that we've got. Okay, and as Ian mentioned in his interview that you did recently with him about the box principle, that my concept has always been, you know, we're not judging martial arts because it has so many outcomes. It's got fitness, it's got pride in performance, it's got competition, full contact points, it's got self-defense. But it isn't self-defense. Self-defense is one of the down the spoke of a wheel from the hub of martial arts, this big box that we've got. Self-defense is one option, but you cannot use that big box for self-defense too much. I'm going to be running on here, but just a point on that. One of the things I realised when I started working on the door, I knew too much. I just had too many options. When I'd got this classic angry man in front of me, it was a series of question marks. That person knew exactly what they were going to do and when. I didn't know when or what I was going to do. You know, I've probably thrown by that time on the door 1 million blocks in training. I knew what was I going to do with this. They were getting within touching distance, and even then I realised action beats reaction. Whoever starts it at touching distance will win it. And the concept I came up with was the egg timer. If you think of a classic egg timer, the old glass with the glass at the top and this little narrow neck, there might be 8 million grains of sand in this, but only one can get through. If they all try to get through at the same time, you get this logjam. And that was what I was experiencing. I'd got all these techniques, all these options, trying to make decisions. I only need one. That's all I need. And I couldn't find it because it's all jamming up. And the classic phrase for that in psychology is paralysis by analysis. I was stopped with that option by too many options. Okay, so that was one of the things I realised on the door. I'll stop there. Ask me a question.
Oh.
Rokas, sorry.
No, I enjoy everything you say. One more thing I found very interesting from looking at their biographies. You were also a bodyguard?
Yes. Yeah.
And worked all across the globe?
Yes.
Tell a little bit about that?
Yeah. I started in the 80s. I attended one of the first commercial bodyguard training courses in the UK, run by a friend of mine, Dennis Martin, who has to get a mention for me as being, in the UK, the leading person on translating martial arts to self-defense. He was ahead of all of us, and I nailed my colours to his mast in a way, seeing where he was going with it, and it opened my mind with a lot of concepts. And he was all over the world picking up information from people, but he ran one of the first commercial bodyguard courses in the UK, which I attended. On that, I met a couple of guys, one of whom's been a long-term close friend of mine. He's just retired from the business only last year, and we formed a small partnership in the 80s to get business. But it was in the 90s when I went into it full-time, and I was working with some friends of mine out of London, dealing with a company from Washington that had all the big corporates as their clients. So we were working east of London, in the former Soviet Union, Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan. So I've looked after the chairman of the New York Stock Exchange in Madrid and Delhi, the Mars family, the Wrigley family. So over 20 to 30 years, probably 30 countries, some of them multiple times, but not just running executive protection, which is the sort of dealing with the corporate side of things, but also doing surveys, risk management work, personal security training, which is still part of what I do from my own security company now, which is a security risk management company. So we're still dealing with big corporates in the UK.
There's, I won't stay here too long, but it is a field I'm least familiar with from these realms, and I'm just curious to ask, in that field, I'm sure there's so much knowledge of expertise that is necessary. Yet I'm curious, how did the martial arts self-defense practice came into the whole realm of security?
Yeah, it doesn't. No.
Okay, that's what I kind of thought.
It's a myth. Right. Yeah. Right. So I've worked 30 odd years, and all over the world, big corporations, and I can't think, apart from moving the shower curtain in a 5-star hotel, I've had much physical input to any of that work. It it isn't a part to play. It becomes that shoot 'em, thump 'em, stab 'em genre, if you like, paradigm, which is not what it's about. You know, it's all about planning. It's all about execution. It's all about the key thing about it is that we bring back to self-defense is personal security awareness, which is one of my big spheres. So if you look at some terminologies, Rokas, that we get familiar with, self-protection, you know, I don't think anybody really ever defines what we mean by that. And for me, self-protection is a combination of two things: self-defense, and let's call that the physical aspects of dealing with a threat, personal security, and you put those two together, that's self-protection. The problem with self-defense is the term is misunderstood, because self-defense is a legal term in British common law, or in English common law, and it's the defense of self-defense. So if you're accused of an excessive use of force, one of your defenses, a legal defense, is the defense of self-defense. But self-defense isn't a physical, although we've adopted it as that. And one of the other problems with using that term is we have self-defense. It conditions us to think that we have to wait for issues to happen.
Right.
Whereas we know if we've got somebody who's a threat moving into that distance, which is say a yard, about touching distance, action will beat reaction. There's only one answer to that. It has to be preemption. There's no other option to it. And this is where I think the martial arts world doesn't get it. The answer is not martial arts in genes. And even people who have good fighting skills, they don't get chance to fight. They just get knocked out by somebody who's got close, hits hard, hits first, uses deception, uses misdirection, doesn't appear a threat till they're within touching distance. So people don't get to do what they're skilled at, which is martial arts and fighting. So self-defense is not fighting. Fighting's a support system. So where people say, we've got really good fighting skills, oh, good, but it ain't going to work when somebody's this close to you, and they go first. So,
what inspired me from what you said is, when I was investigating self-defense, one of the things I realized is if you get into a physical altercation, it almost means like you've made a lot of mistakes.
Yeah.
Like that's like a consequence rather than this is the beginning of self-defense. Right?
Absolutely. Right. Yeah. And this is the problem where we talked before about self-defense sequences in martial arts magazines.
Right.
It's a martial arts magazine, so people want to see a sequence of martial arts used to defeat this thug. You know, this violent individual. It's just rubbish. It just doesn't work like that. How did we get there in the first place? Because the whole thing about personal security is, I have a concept called the threat triangle, the awareness triangle. So what we have at the top of the triangle is fight or flight. So when we really get to a situation where we've got violence as a really close option, we've only got two protocols. We've got fight or flight. And we know that's a psychological term as well, because we have that fight or flight concept where it's linked to those physiological changes, endocrine emergency hormone changes. However, to be ready to fight or flight, we've got to have evaluated a threat. So we have to have seen the threat and evaluated it. But to evaluate something, we have to take information in. So the bottom of the pyramid is constant awareness. So we have this constant awareness of our environment, awareness of people in the environment, and awareness of ourselves. Are we switched on all the time? So are we aware, and are we taking that information in that then allows us to identify and evaluate threats, to either prepare to get out of it or prepare to deal with it, which is fight or flight. The other problem with martial artists is they do not factor in stress. They do not factor in the consequence of emergency hormones, which are to aid fight or flight. But they were never designed to aid fight or flight in a Western society where violence emerges over a timescale. So if you think about, you know, we're 200 odd thousand years ago, we're living in a cave, we walk out the cave, there's a saber-toothed tiger. If saber-toothed tigers were around 200,000 years ago, we don't negotiate with it. It doesn't say, you're having it in 5 minutes. It's immediate. You're either going to club it or you're going to run. And the emergency hormones are there for fuel. Our problem is, when it's not that immediacy of it, it's a build-up, we've got this constant release of emergency hormones that become debilitating. They're not designed to rest with us for any length of time. So there's a concept which is called the anxiety cycle, and it's about cognitive and somatic anxiety. So let's say I'm walking down the street and I see two guys looking at me, pointing, and they're both about 5'8", not particularly big, but look a bit threatening. So I look at them and I think, this could turn interesting, but I think I could cope with that. But I'm still going to get that adrenal response. I'm going to get the emergency hormones. And just to put that in concept, it doesn't matter whether those are triggered by mild concern or stark terror. It's on that that protocol from one point to here, and that's the stress axis. That's just stress. And I talk about a plunger. So if it's mild concern, it's a small plunger. If all of a sudden it's start terror, it's a huge plunge and you get a massive release of hormones. So I'll get a release of emergency hormones, heart rate will go up, knees will start shake a bit, mouth will dry up, hands will feel a bit. I've now looked back at this threat. Now they're 6 foot tall, they've got bigger in the shoulders, and they look meaner. So I get another shot of adrenaline response. Now it's really, I'm feeling all this. I look back, they're now 6'3", they've got knives in the teeth, and I've lost it. Because what I've been more bothered about is what's called somatic anxiety, not cognitive anxiety. I had a natural cognitive anxiety thinking about the threat, but I'd assessed I could deal with it. But now, if you're unfamiliar with these effects, the heart rate, the drying mouth, the shaking a bit, you worry more about this, and that's what martial artists don't factor into it. There's the old saying that in a dojo, excitement up, fear down. Out in the streets, the other way around, it's fear up, not excitement. Okay. So what you do in this open space here, well lit, comfortable, fairly friendly, non-threatening, the sensations are different than you will face out there when that threat is immediate. And the problem is, if you're not aware and taken by surprise, surprise is the fast route to fear. It's a huge plunger which goes into this endocrine vat to throw these emergency hormones out. And it shuts people down because they're not able to utilize it immediately. On that same concept, when you look at those effects, it's all about the parasympathetic nervous system. So again, in times of great stress, our body is designed to fuel and aid fight or flight. It doesn't want us to do certain things, and one of the things it shuts down is digestion. Not that we'd know it, you know, we're not going to feel hungry or not feel hungry. The other thing it shuts down is our brain. So our parasympathetic nervous system, it doesn't want us to be cognitive about the threat. It wants us to react to it. So it cuts the brain down. Where you've got a threat evolving over a period, you can't make a decision to go because and this is what I found on the door. I was trying to make a decision at a time I'd got emergency hormones, at a time I knew too much, so I'd got too many factors coming into that decision making. So what I learned, and it was very strange when Geoff Thompson and I got together to form the British Combat Association, which is 26 years ago, we both had come to the same thing, that what we needed was what we call an action trigger. So we needed something to take the decision making away. I had a word that I'd associated with strikes, practiced on a bag, thousands of times. So I associated the word with a strike. Geoff had used a question. So he'd use a question to engage somebody's brain, and then he'd strike. But we both come to the same principle, that decision making was out of the window, interestingly. And the other thing that people who train on bags don't do is talk to them. Because in any engagement in the street, it's very seldom you're attacked by somebody who's deaf and dumb. It's dialogue. They're using dialogue as a weapon. Right. And we don't say to them, we engage them with dialogue. What we don't practice is dialogue as a technique for scenarios. We should have a script for every scenario so that we can use when we're faced with that. Because that way, when I've got that script, I have my word, which is my action trigger for the strike. Might be a power slap, might be a straight strike, might be a sweep, might be an elbow, depending on the proxemics of somebody. Okay, so all these things are what self-defense is about. The physical side of it, that's a separate thing. It should be limited and it should be highly impactful, which we've talked about, and we'll look at some, you know. So one strike has to do it.
One quick question here. I presume I already know the answer, but I'm still curious to ask. So do you do scenario, or do you stimulate the adrenaline type of training in the training environment for self-defense?
Yeah, you can do. So you've got a thing which is context. Obviously, it's context dependent training, and some people are really good at that. So one of the problems, when I was doing a lot of police training, we did it in gymnasium. You know, we did it in a safe environment. Can you believe? So that, you know, we're risk assessing the place we train for violence in the street. You know, it's a strange concept, really. So in this environment here, it allows us to move around. It allows us to evade things, to move. Whereas in reality, in the street, in a bar, in a street with cars, with furniture, with people, you know, we're limited. Everything we do should be on the basis we've nowhere to retreat to. The moment you bring in that concept of being able to back up somewhere, then you've overstepped the mark. And the other problem where you've got people in fist suits, or similar to fist suits, is when you're doing those scenarios, what people aren't factoring in, it just turns into a brawl. That's one of the problems with that. The person who's defending against an attack might actually have delivered a telling blow, which without the fist suit would have dropped the person. What happens with a lot of them is that it just carries on. The person in the fist suit doesn't stop and say, had I not had this, that would have worked. It just continues to a brawl. So it's not given any confidence to the individual that they've got an impactful strike that would have stopped it. And then it's all about just fighting like some Viking berserker, you know. It's lost that thing. So you can do scenarios, but it's context dependent. And then, as you say, so you've got the context first of all, but then you've got trying to create that whole threat, adrenaline rush, and that's very difficult to do. And that's why I started working on the door. Because even as an experienced international karate, you know, I just always had my doubts that it would work in close proximity. And of course karate doesn't work well at that. Works well at this sort of distance, which is why I always like the Wing Chun, because it trapping at close distance, more use of the arms as feelers. So these hands are like another pair of eyes in a way, you know, so you've got that sensitivity. And then you can create this fence while you're talking with the hands. So they're here to protect that gate at the end of your garden, if you like, where people can't come in. So.
And a couple more things before going to the practical side. You mentioned police, and from what I read, you've taught police for more than a decade, I think. And so what would you say is, because for me it's a kind of a sensitive subject, because a friend of mine teaches police work in one of the countries I know, and I know it's from him it's really a difficult thing to do, because there's so many misconceptions about like what works, what doesn't work, what specifically they should know. So from your experience, what were the main challenges you had to address?
The main challenge, and I started teaching at a facility which was part of National Police Training, as it was called then, and that was in the north of England here, in Yorkshire, just slightly further north. And I was teaching the defensive tactics instructors who were either on new courses coming through or refresher courses. And then eventually, because they were in different forces, I ended up consulting and teaching for them in all these different forces. So I taught for about 10 forces over about 10 years, some of them multiple times. And one of the problems, I realised this very early on, was that you've got police officers who know what the reality of violence is. You've got senior police officers who these days might have fast-tracked, haven't even been in the street, have no concept of what violence is about, who have, and I'm not being unkind, and I use the vernacular, they're just covering their arse with the training that they think they're delivering. And it was quite clear, I had a wheel concept, and they were being taught on kit. So they had batons, they had this kit, they had that kit, they had this kit, side handle batons, straight batons, they had spray, and what they were being trained on was the kit. So each one of those pieces of kit came with a training thing. So if you looked at a side handled baton, the old Monadnock baton, it didn't come with just one A4 piece of paper with two techniques on. There was a book on the Monadnock. I think it was written by the brother-in-law of the guy who invented it and then manufactured it. I think it was 30 pages, including two officers using the batons to create a ladder to walk up a fence, you know, a wire fence.
Wow.
So you could think of the police in the UK going, this is the answer to everything. If we teach people this, they've got the answer. So they trained on kit. What they never trained was the individual. So all you got was train this kit, train that kit, train that kit. The person was never trained. So they had no unarmed skills. So for me, a weapon in the hands of somebody who has no unarmed skills is pretty useless.
Right.
So we went right back to training that individual on all the things we talked about, the psychology, that preemption. So I was teaching preemption, preemptive strikes and impact development. That was what I taught all the police forces. Never changed it. Wouldn't change it for civilians, didn't change it for the police. And then we started to introduce that same double hip and impact into some of the weapon work. But then we closed it down. We didn't have them being able to run around the dojo doing it, around the training hall. And I also acted as an expert witness in court cases. So where I acted in court cases pretty much where there was a police officers accused of excessive force.
Right, that was
so,
what was it I actually wanted to ask you about right away, because if it is already a sensitive subject, from what I know in self-defense, of the preemptive strike can lead to trouble afterwards.
Yeah.
In the context of police looking at it, but then it makes me even more curious. What about police using preemptive strikes?
Yeah, it's quite legitimate. It's legitimate within common law. So, if you know, not to go into the whole detail of it, but English common law is built up on what we call case precedent. So, a particular case that's gone to a high court determines future cases and cases. So, you think of firearms officers who might shoot somebody with a plastic gun, but at night it looks like a gun. The guy pulls it, he's going to shoot. But that, at the end of the day, the facts are that that was a plastic gun. There was no actual threat. But at the time, that officer held an honest belief about the circumstances. And that's what predominates, really. Did you hold an honest belief about how quickly that violence would happen, how it was likely to happen? And preemption is enshrined in case precedent. There are cases where, without quoting the actual case, a judge has said, you know, we don't expect that somebody has to wait to fire the first shot or throw the first strike. You know, a preemptive strike is quite allowed under common law. But it's just, you have to justify it like you would any use of force. It's no different. Whether you twisted somebody's arm and the wrist broke or whether you hit them, it's the same. You have to justify it from reasonable, proportionate, and all these things, you know. But it's certainly, it's an accepted concept for all of us, for police officers. The law's no different. Law's no different for police officers than for us.
That's great. Yeah. And two more questions. So one, the whole dilemma of martial arts. It's a common thread through my public work. And I really like what you said before we started recording about karate works well against karate. Yeah. So can you tell a little bit about that? Yeah,
I think that's one of a couple of things really. What we have predominantly we're talking about, whether it's Aikido, whether it's karate, whether it's judo, jiu-jitsu, these are Eastern martial arts which come with a cultural hue, a cultural colour to them. And now we've got them in the West and we've adopted them as art, as sport, as competition, and we're now thinking in whole, not in part, we've got that as a system for effective self-defense for alcohol-fueled Western violence, and it doesn't work. So when we look at what I'm best at is fighting karate people, because I do karate or kickboxing. It's great. We can exchange sophisticated techniques and blows, but the concept I've used all the time, and the article I've written, I think essentially, is called Thugs and Chess. And that is, I'm a grandmaster at chess. And I'm playing somebody for whom drafts, as we call it, or checkers, is a hard mental concept. It's just going to be a car crash. It won't work. And that's the same as having sophisticated martial arts and a drunken thug in the UK who's used to knocking people out with one blow, and it's worked for years for him. No sophistication, no bells, no whistles, no referees, no flags, deception, talking in, appearing no threat, and then bang. So Eastern martial arts works best against Eastern martial arts, you know. But having said that, it's great to do it, great to enjoy it, great to mix them in that big box. But when it comes to self-defense, we take a couple of those effective things out, and that we don't let that box spill over. Otherwise, that's going to be that car crash for us.
A big one for me that I keep coming back to is basically, and I did Wing Chun for a little bit, but not that much. But still, I know it's one of those controversial. I think, like when you look at Aikido, if the person has a clear head and knows about fighting or self-defense, it's very clear that it's not effective. So I'd say it's like I like to say it's like on the far per se left.
Yeah.
Wing Chun is there's striking, there's kicking, and it looks visibly more effective.
Yeah.
And that's why people, I think it's more to the right side, but still not on the most effective side.
Yeah.
But that's where people get confused, and even myself, I'm still keep on asking myself, so how effective it is in terms of even fighting. So could you say a few words?
Yeah, I think that's a bit like the stress spectrum. You know, there are extremes. So we've got mild concern at this end, stark terror here. We've got karate here, maybe this far down this spectrum of effectiveness. We've got Wing Chun that moves, I think, more down that spectrum that you're talking about to the right, because it works at a closer distance, which is a more realistic distance. Although karate has techniques before anybody writes in saying, we've got elbows, we've got the knee, we know that. But it operates, we're used to competitive karate in this thing. And I know we do bunkai, but some of that you can't translate to a street environment. So no, I think Wing Chun moves this way. You've got some modern martial arts like Kudo, where you've got that combination of Kyokushinkai, you've got throws, you've got head strikes, you've got the protection on, but that really is a fighting system. And what we're going to be careful of, that there's two spectrum here. We've got the spectrum of fighting systems, and then we've got the spectrum of what works in self-defense. And none of those, in whole, work for self-defense. Wing Chun people will get knocked out by boxers. No two ways about it. You see good Wing Chun people who recognize that, like you have with the Aikido, experimenting with working against other systems, like boxing, like karate, like judo. So you get a judo player who closes with you, I don't care what you do, you're going to be going over in a circle, you know, you're going to be taking a trip in an arc to the floor. Once they get a grip, that's effective. So where do we put judo on that? But it's a classic sport. So you've got those two spectrums. You've got sport, you've got art, you've got fighting systems, and then you've got, really, start another spectrum. My question is, because I love Wing Chun, but what I've wanted to do is just take the bits out that I know will fit in within that arena, if you like, of violent self-defense in a Western alcohol-fueled situation. You know, what elements come out of that? Sensitivity, active hands, close proximity, all those things that you would take out, center line, covering the center line. So, you know, some good things in Wing Chun. But Wing Chun works best against Wing Chun. You know, it's like sticking hands, you know. You cannot say to somebody, before you kick off, let's do some sticking hands, a bit of cheese out. It's like chess again, chess and thugs. Two do not go together, you know. So elements of this, elements of that. And less is more in the street. Absolutely less is more. You know, people think complexity is an advantage. You know, that's just, you know, banal. Yeah.
Absolutely. And the very last question before we move on to the practical side, for people who want to become much safer, but there's so much out there and so much confusion and misunderstandings. So what would be your first suggestion for that person? Where should they start? An
understanding of personal security, an understanding of creating permanent awareness. So you've got, first of all, you've got the understanding of creating personal awareness, awareness evaluation, and then avoidance, fight or flight. But then you've got a whole range of do's and don'ts in the street. Do's and don'ts in vehicles, how you park, how you would drive, how you would enter buildings, maybe in hotel rooms, in offices, you know, all the different environments. There are do's and don'ts to doing all of that. And one of the problems, I think, again with martial arts is there's very little planning in how they approach violence. It's this concept, well, I know a lot, therefore it'll work if it comes on top. But when they walk into a place, and it's a barn in an area you don't know and it looks a bit rough, you've got to start making an evaluation of people So that I have a concept, it's called the 4Ds, which is dressed, drunk, drugged, demeanour. So how's somebody dressed? So let's say it's summer, you've got a t-shirt on. So if you came over, I know that straightforward piston strike will work. If it's winter, you've got that, a shirt, a cardigan, a jacket and a leather jacket, you're wearing armour plate. So I'm not going to do that. But I've assessed that before you come over. So how are you dressed? Dressed drunk. If you're drunk, you're not going to listen to reason. Also, your pain threshold has gone up. So twisting your arm up the back and hoping that ain't going to work, that's out there. Control and restraints, technical term in martial arts, that's bollocks. Okay? Control and restraint is a team effort, works well in the prison service. Police never get it to work. One-on-one, you're never going to twist the arm up the back of an angry man. It just isn't going to work. So, and if they're drunk, pain compliance has gone up. Dressed, drunk, drugged, same thing as the thing. And then demeanour. Who's loud? Who's aggressive? Who's showing out? Who's potentially violent? That assessment should be made so that we're now at that pyramid, we've evaluated things, we're not going to be taken by surprise. We've even predetermined the strike we're going to do on somebody if it kicks off. And also, let's say I've gone in a bar somewhere and it's a floor, solid stone floor, and it's wet and I've got leather shoes on. You're in trainers. You've got good footing, I've not. There's a consideration, you know. Am I standing up? Am I at the bar? How am I? All these things have to be taken into account. But if we're not aware on that whole personal security level, these things, they're just not there in people's consciousness, you know. And then you're going to be taken by surprise. We talked before, last concept is about startle response. And we talked about that prior. I won't mention why we're talking about it, but and this is another thing that when you looked at, we talked about the action trigger. So mine was a word, and what I realised was when I was making decisions, I was leaving it too late. So I needed to have an action trigger, which was a word associated with a strike. But the concept I used for that was primary conditioning, Pavlovian conditioning. So you can't do something 10 times and you're going to have it associated as a complete automatic response. It's something you have to do hundreds and hundreds of times to get that to be what we call conditioned response. So one of the problems when we're taken by surprise, we have a startle response. So if somebody now behind you let off a pistol, you'd have an automatic, your head would go down, your hands would come up, and then you'd try and locate the threat. And it's the same when people have gone and trained to do anti-skid work in a car. So they spent a week doing anti-skid training. They go home, it's winter, they're on a mountain pass and they hit a thing of ice. What they've been told for that whole week is, if you hit the ice, don't hit the brakes and don't whip the wheel. The first thing they do in the startle response, hit the brake, twizzle the wheel, and they've just done skid pan training. So they've got a startle response. That's the startle response. As they're going over the cliff on a 1,000-foot drop in the car, they'll go, train response. I shouldn't hit the brake and I shouldn't, it's too late. So what we have to do, by repetition and repetition and repetition, is move the trained response we want to the startle response. That's one of the things we have to get through. Okay. And in between all that, as you get the startle response, you've got the adrenal responses. So normally you get the startle response, like the stone coming to the car window. We don't think about it. It's a reaction, which is great. You know? So when you come to that Pavlovian conditioning, it runs through a lot of what we should be doing. And one of the other problems we get in martial arts is that people are conditioned by authority. And I was, when we started off, all of us were in traditional karate. We took somebody's word for things. So if you look at the Royal Society, the scientific institution in the UK, started in the mid-1660s, got royal assent. Its motto is nullius in verba, which says take nobody's word for it, or as I always used to express it, by no authority. So you take nobody's authoritative word for something that hasn't been tested scientifically, experimentally as a fact. And that's why in martial arts, we take too much authority handed down from people in generations. We're not testing it. We're not, it's feeling is believing with impact. Most karate people think they impact. They don't. It's fresh air. So.
Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. No.
It's very quickly just reminding me of there was this kind of a show on television where they took different martial artists and took scientists and did some tests. And one of the tests was there was a dummy which calculated the impact. Right. And there were a few different martial artists and a boxer, like a heavyweight champion. Yeah. And then the karate person, you could see that he was so sure he will get such great impact. Yeah. And it was like, okay. Yeah. And then the boxer did it. Not to say that boxing is better or anything, but just the boxer did it. And it was just like, it was like a car hit the dummy. But it was interesting to observe how the karate person was sure that he will get most impact, but it was not an efficient way to
conditioned by authority. Right, exactly. Being told that. And one of the problems with karate in the UK, I'm off to one side slightly here, but when we started, we had Japanese instructors very early on who were domiciled in the UK, in Wado, couldn't speak English, so we couldn't ask questions, so we just copied. So we copied them. But because we couldn't ask questions, when we started teaching, we did the same thing. We wouldn't let people question us. Still happens now in traditional systems. We don't ask me a question, you're just going to do what I tell you. One, because we couldn't answer the question because we'd never been able to ask it ourselves. And we learnt by copying. And I can see a source of somebody's karate. I can go back and say I know where that's come from. Because what we have is what I call a bad photocopy. That's how we're teaching people. That person copies that, then the next copy, then the next, and each one gets fainter and fainter. So the quality of it gets less, but each one comes with the authority of that individual, and it shouldn't do. It should be tested. That's important. Nullius in verba. Take nobody's word for it, not even mine. Not even mine. Has to be tested.
The very last thing I wanted to make sure that gets into this video is personal safety, self-security. Yes. You mentioned about that it's important. That's the first step to get to. I have a feeling probably that is covered quite well in one of your books or your books. So maybe you can tell which books people could look
I sort of enshrined all that. As you know, I've written 4 books and innumerable articles, but I started with The Modern Bodyguard. Streetwise, which is the one we're talking about. So Streetwise is all about personal security and then self-defense, but the concepts of self-defense. Then Fit to Fight, which was all about high-level training to prepare for both competition and self-defense. So pushing yourself, really the training that we do here, if you ever get a chance to come and train with us, it's intense. And I've always had that attitude to training. Ian will confirm that, and anybody else who's trained here. It's heart-stopping because getting through that conditions us to know that we'll get through a fight if something turns into a fight. If preemption doesn't work, our support system as a fight, we're not going to give up. Right. We've done it 5 days a week. This particular day shouldn't be any different. Okay, so Modern Bodyguard, Streetwise, Fit to Fight, and then a book on international travel security, which is Travel Safe. But Streetwise is, that's the book. The personal security. Yeah.
Well,
great. Yeah. Just a point on doing this. So we're just going to look at the double hit. One of the problems is I tend not to do it on camera because this is the ABC of it. So you get people look at it and say, well, that ain't going to work. It's too slow and it's telegraph. No, this is like. This is watching a car wheel go round at 4 miles an hour, so we can see how it works. Right. It doesn't mean it can't go at 400 miles an hour. Right. We're just showing it at 4 miles an hour. So it's just the simple ABC mechanics of it.
I can easily say, so people will see soon enough what you'll demonstrate, but already I was on the other end of the strike, and I can say, you would say, so this is a light version. And I recognize from your motion that it is a light version, but the impact, I was thinking to myself, thank goodness it's not a full-on version, because it's really, the power, Gabriel said it is visible, and it's, hopefully people will see it, but I can definitely attest it is very powerful.
Yeah, and there's nothing sort of martial arts about it in a way. It's not, it's, as I explained before, or explain later, it's by analogy with how any sport gets a dynamic effect, whether it's a shot put, throwing a stone, a goal stroke, a tennis, javelin, shot put. The way they do it isn't the way we've ever been taught in martial arts. And at the end of the day, the concept is, very simply, these are tools. That's a tool, this is a tool, shoulder's a tool, knee, foot, whatever it is, whatever part of the body we're going to hit with. It's simply a tool via which we move our body weight into the opponent's body weight. That's it. And we hopefully move it at some speed. So that strike that you've had, I'm trying to get 13 stone on the end of this. And that then isn't surface impact, it drops inside you. That's what will shut people down. Whether it slaps to the face, strikes to the body. So what we're after is maximum effect, maximum disability of the individual with little damage. So that once we've got that and we've got control, post that there's no damage. So punching to the face is out. When I acted as an expert witness, we had a case, it was a prosecution of a doorman, and he'd punched somebody in the face. It was a student who probably didn't need punching in the face, but the first photograph you saw was the individual, and all they had was a cut here. So you think, well, what's all this about?
Right.
But then the teeth were pulled, the lips were pulled back, he'd lost all his teeth.
Wow.
So that was a massive amount of damage that probably didn't get the effect that the doorman wanted.
Yeah.
So it was inappropriate, not proportionate, it was damaging, whereas a slap to the face would have put the person out and left them with a red mark, and would have been proportionate if a strike was determined as reasonable and necessary in the first place. Reasonable, necessary, proportionate, all of that. Okay, so hitting soft damageable tissue. So when you think of the face, we know about hitting the jaw, so it's an accepted thing. We hit the jaw, shakes the brain, knocks somebody out. It's a precise target at a time we don't want precise targets. We want big centre mass targets side of the face. Your head is either armour plate or soft damageable tissue. That's the problem. You're either going to hit armour plate and damage yourself, or you're going to hit soft tissue and damage them. So straight punches the body, slaps to the face, sweeps, knee strikes. Okay.
Got it. Very quickly before you stand up, I want to make sure. Something I wanted to bring up as well is that, especially I guess martial artists or some self-defense systems which are not really complete, they forget about the kind of, you could say, like the third stage of or the after the fighting. Most people are like, okay, I just need to win, and they forget that how they per se win, which is not the point of self-defense anyway, but then they forget that that can get them into a lot of trouble, and that
absolutely
has to be,
absolutely. So you've got, and that comes back to the problem with Martial Arts Magazine, one in the self-defense. First of all, how did we get to that? What led up to it? And now what's happening after it? Where's the post-management? Did we do something with the intention of escaping? Were we fixed in that because we're in security, working a door, we're a police officer, so we can't go anywhere, we have to stay and manage it? And if we do hit and strike and run off, who's telling the tale afterwards? What tale is being told? So when you look at the police training, and in Ian's interview with you, he mentioned a Venn diagram. So a Venn diagram, a great Venn diagram on conflict management that slightly fell out of favour with the police, but I think it's absolutely ideal, is 3 overlapping circles. So you've got offender behaviour. What's the level of the offender behaviour in steps? So then you've got officer options, reasonable officer / civilian options, and then other factors that come into it. So it might be that this person's 6 foot, you're 5'6", you're a female, there's 3 of them. So you've got a whole range of factors that come into that. Now the Venn diagram, where they overlap is the reasonable actions, options that you have. Taking all these things, the weather, the conditions, underfoot, the clothing, you know, are you injured in the first place? Are you fit? Are you trained? Is that person a known violent criminal? So all these things in this Venn diagram, where they all overlap, says, this is what I believe I can do. And it might be application of deadly force. It might be the only option. Or it might be a strike to buy time to run away. So when you look at that proxemics that we're talking about, action beats reaction, I've got a thing which is, it's called the 1 yard rule, which came out of special forces training, which was where you've got an armed undercover individual who's now got somebody quite close who's drawing a weapon on them. Originally, what they were doing was trying to outdraw them. It was like Dodge City. And what they realised was, you're not going to make it work. That was where the punch to buy time came in. So what they did was interrupt that plan of action by hitting the person to buy time to draw. And it's still used now. Some police forces use it, some special forces use it in the States. You'll see videos on it, practicing that punch to buy time, that was not by authority. That was by, hang on, what we're doing isn't working. Right. You know, let's experiment. So that came in. So, yeah.
Well, shall
right.
we take a look?
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. Let's.